mention that the film Argo is about the same events of this book, Street Politics, while reading the part about how it ended. So, if you're interested, you can watch Ben Affleck's Hollywood version of the events, and you could also listen to what Asif Bayat has to say about Tehran during this time. Housing seizures proved to be a very acute crisis. Direct actions such as factory takeovers, the government could secure the ownership of the enterprises eventually. The enterprises would belong to the state or the original owners, and the workers could maintain some degree of control over the operation through organizations of the factory shuras. But the buildings were quite different. The squatters would usurp the occupied properties. There was no easy short term and middle of the road solution, especially since many unfinished apartments, unlike the luxury villas and hotels, belong legally to individuals such as school teachers and government employees for whom the previous regime had built homes as part of their benefits. The new authorities were consequently caught up between threats of disorder and chaos, of losing their legitimacy as the servants of the dispossessed, and of being irrelevant. On the other hand, the instability of the regime, with the intense power struggle at the top and the constant turnover of politicians, meant there was hardly a consistent policy to deal with the problem. The Housing Foundation, along with a number of radical clerical leaders such as Khosrow Shahi, Karoubi, and Beheshti, encouraged takeovers. The provisional government of Mehdi Bazargan opposed the action vehemently. The consequent Rajai's cabinet tolerated it without, however, giving it official recognition. Indeed, the authorities' response to the squatting crisis during the first 2 years remained decentralized. It was handled mainly by the local power centers, especially the local committees or pastaran, and the local mullahs and their armed men centered in the mosques. The committee's position on the issue depended on which authorities they were following, sympathetic or critical. The radical clergy's sympathy for the squatters had in general the political aim of undermining the provisional government. Yet, since the squatters were mobilized by radical left groups, the pastaran were quick to oppose the squatters on the ground that they were acting as agents of the communists. The success of the local pastoran in ending the occupation and extent of the squatters' hold over the occupied properties depended on a balance of forces at both national and local levels. The power struggle at the top between the liberals and the radical clergy offered breathing space to the ordinary citizens in their mobilizational efforts. The schism reflected itself at the localities, with groups allying with this or that governmental tendency or personality. So there was a famous person in Iraq as well, Mullah Sadr. It's a repetition of the 70s in Iran, but that was Iraq. But there were other players on the local level as well: the squatters, their leftist allies, the local pastaran, local mosques and mullahs, and the owners of the occupied homes. In short, the degree of the squatters' hold over the occupied properties varied a great deal. It depended on how organized they were, how forceful the original owners were, who the owners were, either the older elites or ordinary people, and which officials the squatters resorted to. This may explain why some squatters managed to stay on, others lasted over 6 years, and some, like those in occupied hotels, were evicted after a few weeks. The ways in which the government and the pastaran confronted the housing rebels varied. They adopted different tactics. Sometimes they used verdicts denouncing the un-Islamic nature of their actions, and divide and rule tactics, cutting water, electricity, arrests, and armed raids. Some, mainly students, left without much resistance. Others did so after obtaining compensation or a promise of alternative housing. Many resisted and stayed on, though some agreed to pay some compensation to the government. Students were among the first to vacate the hotels largely of their free will. Immediately after the seizure of the U.S. Embassy by the militant students on November 4th, 1979, many hotels were evacuated. Even prior to that event, ideological division within the organizing student bodies in the hotels already undermined the viability of long-term occupation. The students sympathizing with the Mujahideen argued for peaceful evacuation, though these kinds of direct actions would undermine the nascent regime's position with the West. The Marxist students, in contrast, wanted to stay unless the government did something for the housing conditions. In many hotels, this division paralyzed the protective function of the shuras. With the seizure of the U.S. Embassy, as the left-wing participant put it, the justification behind the occupation lost its validity. In this situation, the excuse of student housing also shed its legitimacy. Although a number of the students retained some hotels, for instance, those in Takht-e-Taus and Karim Khan in Tehran, because the owners were opulent royalists, the political logic of student squatting made the occupation far less viable. The situation with the poor squatters were quite different. For them, squatting was not a battle, but simply a way to survive. Defending their gains was vital. From the beginning, I have sacrificed all my things on this revolution. I have sold my carpet and TV to pay for my costs. Now I won't leave this home. You see, we too have the right to live a life. I want to say to those who want us to leave this place, first give us a place of our own, end quote. The squatters were invariably denounced in public by some religious authorities as counter-revolutionaries. So one Kansari said they're taking advantage of the goodwill of the provisional government. They have illegally seized these apartments in the days that our combatant people were engaged in armed struggle. For the most part, the authorities condemned the squatters and justified their eviction. Ayatollah Khomeini and Marashi issued fatwas ruling that occupying homes was haram. In one specific case in Mashhad, they ruled that the prayer was unacceptable in these houses. In response, squatters referred to earlier proclamations on free housing and urban services by Khomeini. Does the government not plan to provide housing? Asked one of the squatters who demanded his eviction. We have behaved, and their armed men centered in the local mosques. The committee's position on the issue depended on which authorities they were following, sympathetic or critical. The clergy's sympathy for the squatters in general had the political aim of undermining the provisional government. Yet, since the squatters were mobilized by the leftist groups, the Pastoran were quick to oppose them. This is a repeated section. I don't know if he noticed, or maybe I have scrolled up. Anyways, I've already read that part. Another quote. We are mustazaf in the real sense. Otherwise, we wouldn't invade the apartments in such a manner. We have been tenants for a long time, have enormous hardships, a miserable life. All our concern has been to feed our children and pay rent, which in most cases we simply could not manage. Our children have never tasted any kind of fruit throughout the year. After the strikes that broke the Shah's back, and ours as well, our situation got worse, so that we could hardly pay our rent and make ends meet. So we had no choice but to resort to squatting. Indeed, the motives behind each group's influenced their outcome. Sheer shortage of urban housing were problems upon which the squatters reflected, problems the government strove to address. However, the government's inability to resolve the problem, together with an total collapse in private investment in housing, the flooding of war refugees, and the new waves of rural migrants, basic dwelling continued to remain a chief issue that galvanized social activism of the disenfranchised groups. The movement made important gains by allocating homes among some poor families. It faced limitations before long. Activist support for the movement was curtailed by the advent of political repression. In addition, the short supply of usurpable homes and subsequent legal complications made the option non-viable. The poor needed to adopt a sustainable strategy to suit the subsequent period of political normalcy and stability. They did so by returning to a strategy of individual and silent encroachment. Quiet squatting and illegal construction of thousands of plots of land in the back streets of urban centers and beyond was seen as the most viable solution. And then the next chapter, Backstreet Politics, Squatters and the State, is about this. This is chapter 5. I have talked to many residents of these sharaks, settlements in Persian. Apart from many who have come from other towns and villages, there are also those who come from different neighborhoods of Tehran. I myself was a tenant in a home in Tehran, but realized that I could not afford to pay the rent. Negotiations with the landlord went nowhere. So one day a colleague told me, "Why don't you take a look at the areas around Salve Road?" Well, I came here and settled. Now I am happy, and at least my family lives under a roof. This is a squatter in Salve Road in South Tehran. In post-revolutionary Iran, the poor realized that radical, direct, collective action belonged to an exceptional conjuncture, and the phase of political normality and regime stability required a movement with a new strategy, low-key, non-provocative, often individualistic, requiring patience, precision, and perseverance. Because squatting homes and hotels proved to be non-viable, many poor turned to silently settling in territories outside the big cities, away from the watchful eye of the police, putting up shelters and settling up communities without much regard to regulations or legality. To secure their status in face of the state, economic hardship, and social anomie, both traditional networks and modern associations became an inseparable part of their life. Kinship and ethnic identities cemented their collective existence. Modern associations, in their restricted forms, strove to articulate spatial solidarity, overriding the kinship divisions. And then the author goes on to locate the shanty settlement Zaghe of Zanjan-e-Janubi Street increased by 140%, and those of Soleimaniye, Risalat Highway, Zanjan-e-Shomali Street, and Tajrish almost doubled. In the meantime, new communities emerged in Maidan-e-Azadi and South Tehran. Thus, the total population in Godnishnan and shanty dwellers within the capital city reached 100,000 households by early 1980. And then we will continue in our next live. Take care. Bye.